Hello, and welcome to the Creative Venture Podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Matt Price, a location sound recordist with over 600 projects under his belt. Many of you will know Matt for his YouTube channel, offering audio advice and interviewing some of the biggest names in the industry. And after over 10 years of putting sound to picture, Matt is also working on 2 businesses he's co-founded with his wife. In the podcast, Matt tells us about how he went from an 11-hour commute from Dundee, Scotland, to setting up a successful freelance business. Matt has been hugely influential for me, so I'm all the more excited about sharing this one with you. And I also wanted to just take the time to say thank you to all the people that have been DMing, reviewing, and sending positive feedback. My aim with this project is to give you guys relevant advice and the confidence to smash it in your career. So, without further ado, all this and more coming up on the Creative Venture Podcast. Matt Price.
Hello.
Welcome, and thank you very much for coming on board with the podcast.
That's all right. Thank you for coming around and setting up in my living room. It's very convenient.
I'm super excited to be speaking to you, not only because you're in the field of audio, but I've spoken to loads of creatives sort of on this project. And what particularly interests me about your journey is, one, you're incredibly hardworking, but also you've just been so strategic in your approach. So just take me back, to making films of your friends and taking 11+ hour bus journeys from Dundee to London and back.
Indeed.
But yeah, just tell me a little bit about how you've gone from that to where you are today.
So I guess my story is one of kind of just practicality and almost a bit necessity as well. So it all starts back with when YouTube's starting to come out. I'm still like at doing my A-levels and things like that.
Okay.
And I was just starting to make movies and things with my friends. Not very good movies like zombie movies, or just like skits about like when MySpace goes down and terrible things that should never really see the light of day. And then it just came to a point where it was always in my mind that university was just a natural next step. Not that I hadn't had jobs on the side, but I definitely didn't want to work in a shop full time and then somehow figure out what I wanted to do. And so I just thought film school, but rather than try and pick a very hard and difficult course to get onto, I was like, what is the easiest film course that I can get onto in terms of UCAS? So there was these UCAS points. You had to basically get loads of points if you were doing something very academic, and not many points if you were doing something that was, I guess, more arty or subjective. And so, I chose a course with 80 UCAS points, which I think is 1D at A level. So a lot to aspire to. But the key thing was that it was a foundation degree. And so that meant that there was basically less kind of paperwork, as it were. And there's more kind of like actually doing it. And since I didn't really know what I was doing, that sounded perfect. So then I get to Leeds Met, Northern Film School, as it's probably still called, but it's all part of the same university. Then I basically quickly discover that everyone in my class definitely knows a lot about film in terms of like the black and white ones, the Russian one that's like all in one take. All these famous names, and kind of they're saying the right things. Whether they've done anything at this point, I don't know. Whether you're just like a film buff or you've like made some movies.
Right, okay.
And I was just kind of very transparent and kind of like, my favorite film is Aladdin, when everyone was going around on like the first day.
They were like film noir.
Exactly. And I was like, Robin Williams as the genie is probably going to be the best character of all time.
We heard it here.
So exactly, not a great start. And then you get this kind of enrollment. So what you have to do is you have to specialize. And so you get to try all the different departments. So and already I knew in my course that most people wanted to either go into camera or they wanted to go into directing and writing.
Yes.
And then there's all these kind of areas on the side, obviously like the editing, the sound, art direction, all that kind of stuff where I guess they look more like supporting roles in a film. One of them was sound. And for me, that perfectly mixed a kind of creative space with practical, technical boundaries.
Yes, yeah, art and science. Yeah.
Yeah, so about 2 months of this course, again, don't really know anything. I just kind of decide that sound is going to be the best thing. And so then the next thing I do is basically go about doing as many films as I possibly can. And
yes, and I mean, when you say as many films as you possibly can, you were telling me before we started rolling that what it's like 40 films or something like that, 50 films.
So I ended up being there for like 3 years. I ended up doing a top-up year where it is like a bachelor's of arts. But I just did that for the extra time. But basically every year I was doing my years, the year above, the third year, and the masters. And
I suppose you're in demand as well, really. If it's a job that maybe not everyone's jumping on, if you're the sound guy, then...
Well, I figured out that the niche, in terms of sound, if you know that you're already into sound, you go do a sound course. You don't do a film course. And so it just so happened that I was kind of lucky enough to basically discover sound while doing a film course. Obviously, the downsides of that is that it isn't a sound course, and so it doesn't have all of the kind of facilities to basically allow you to produce good sound, as it were, in terms of like the amount of recordings, or like recorders, or the mixers, or the studio. But what it does is it gives you a lot of chance to work on a lot of films. So yeah, every year I was doing a number of films, like basically throughout the whole year. I decided pretty early on as well that I was just going to punt all the coursework. But that was just because it felt more like a theory in swimming. It's like I'm going to a swimming class and they really want you to write about it, but you don't really know how to swim yet. So I just rather practice swimming than writing about swimming, or the contextual like landscape of swimming at the time compared to swimming before. So yeah, but then this spins off into obviously all my stuff later on with the blog and things like that.
So yeah, do bring us up to date. Yeah, so what are you working on at the moment?
Working on all sorts of stuff. So generally, a couple of feature films a year, quite a lot of short films, and then the rest is kind of branded creative content slash documentaries, and a kind of mix in between of documentaries sponsored by people or like creative content about people. And so that's a good mix for me.
Well, I'm really interested in community, and I think that definitely you've established an online community, and no doubt had to establish a community of people in person to get clients and to do the 500 plus projects you've done. So yeah, when we think about community, what's the sort of value in community for you, would you say?
So community and network is everything. There is a case where you could get by as a person in the industry just doing one job for one person and then never working for that person again. But how I like to frame things is that if you worked with someone over the course of the rest of your life, I put an arbitrary number to that of like £100,000 in terms of like maybe a couple of £1,000 a year, and then you're working 70 years together or something crazy like that. And then that really shifts the dynamic. It takes a lot of pressure off you trying to find work. It's a lot easier to get referrals. It's a lot easier to build high quality work in a way, because if you get on with someone in your community, whatever level you're at, if you feel that they are going to try and deliver really, really good work, and obviously they're willing to be like flexible with you and your demands to be able to achieve what they want to achieve, then a community is a place where you can have a real true value exchange of working on a project that's not only meaningful in terms of sound, but for the wider scope of, I guess, the medium, which is either film or podcast or whatever it is.
And for people that are sort of following or wanting to follow a similar sort of career trajectory to yourself, would you say that community, seeking out that community is something that is really important that they should start trying to do straight away?
Yeah, I'd say you've got two options. You either go out and try and seek one, or you try and kind of reverse engineer it and bring people to you in your community. So for me, early on, it was figuring out that obviously when you're starting out, I had no leverage. So I have nothing really to be able to bargain with that much. I mean, I'm up in Dundee. I've done a few films, so that's a bit to bargain with, but get someone to travel 500 miles on a bus to work on your film, you have to make sure that you can try and offer even more kind of intangible things. You have obviously the tangible elements like the gear, but the intangible things such as your attitude, your personality, how cooperative you are, essentially doing it for the project rather than doing it for yourself in a weird way. is going to really help that value exchange and help you basically sustain a lifestyle as well as delivering kind of really good work.
Perfect, yeah. There's an American entrepreneur called Jim Rohn. I don't know if you've come across him at all, but he's well known for saying that you're the sum total of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And when I first heard that, it got me thinking about the people that I was spending time with and whether they were, say, additive or more negative personalities. And I'm interested to know, have you ever actively sought out the right creative tribe around you? And has choosing, the right people to hang around with been important to you in, say, uni and also when you were starting out?
So for me, it was really interesting because prefacing like having to go back to Dundee, I actually spent a year, I finished uni and then I basically spent a year following a girl to Canada, but then it didn't work out. And so then I was back to square one and I felt like I just missed out on a whole year and I was suddenly behind. And so I basically had this massive chip on my shoulder. And then 2 weeks in, I was on mandy.com every day, which is like a free website for like trying to get jobs. And I basically managed to bag like a last minute feature film. I literally applied on the Thursday. They got back to me and I interviewed on the Friday. I interviewed on the Saturday. And then they were like, okay, you can come. And then I had one day to basically use all my fee up front to then buy as much gear as I could to be able to make the film work. So I think it's really interesting. Definitely your friends or who you're spending your time with have a big influence, but it's more on their attitude and outlook to what they want to achieve. Obviously, I spent a year and a half essentially like on a bus from Dundee to London and back because I was using all that extra money to go into gear instead of going into rent. And so although it was incredibly long and I met some very interesting people on the bus, it's just the sacrifice and the kind of mindset that you need to basically establish yourself in a proper way. So if the people around you are settling for almost a mediocrity or like the standard or coming up with there's basically a million reasons why I shouldn't be where I am today, and that's because I live too far away. I didn't know anyone in London. I'd never grown up in London. I'd never been to kind of a bigger film school. I never even stayed around the area where my film school was, where my network would be. And I'm applying for jobs on a website where generally they're free or very, very kind of low pay because they have the leverage because they have a job, but they don't have the people to actually do the job. So then the onus basically becomes on me to try and make it happen. And so then later on, my approach again was kind of quantity over quality in terms of I would rather do 500 projects that were, it's hard to say that they're mediocre, but basically if you judge a person on 500 projects compared to 10 projects, I think the progression, unless the talent is already there from project number 1, the progression of 500 projects versus 10 is going to be astronomical. And that's why we're lucky in this kind of role that I'm in, because with obviously a director or a producer, it's not feasible to make like 30, 40 films a year unless you are literally like living your life like doing nothing else. Whereas sound, it's a day here, it's 3 days here, it's a month here, there.
It's very doable.
Yeah, and so it's more, you're able to build up that network more rapidly if you're just willing to kind of sacrifice to basically get in it.
What really fascinates me is, one, the fact that you've been so hardworking, but also just trying to get my head around the idea of that 11-hour commute, because I think there's just so many people that wouldn't do it. And for many people that, listen to success stories, it's easy to get disheartened and feel like, oh, wow, I'll never achieve what Matt's achieved. But I think it's really important to highlight that your situation wasn't perfect. It's not like there were no obstacles to overcome. You were hundreds of miles from the work you wanted to do. And I think a lot of people in that situation would be like, well, it's not going to work, I'll just give up here, I'll just get a standard job. And what I'm interested to know is, that perseverance, that element in your psyche that made you push through that. Is that a natural thing, or is that something that you've learned over time?
So obviously I have a lot of time to think on the bus, but so a lot of these things are developed over time. Yes. But I think for me it was, where do I choose to sacrifice? basically, it got down to the rationale of my head that the bus was going to be the easier way to do it. The harder way to do it was to try and have a job kind of 9 to 5 and only do films on a Friday. And again, then over the next 5 years, I only end up with 10 films instead of like the hundreds that I ended up with. So it was, do I want to sacrifice now or do I want to sacrifice a lot later? So for instance, if I was 30 and I was still making like 15 grand or something a year after doing it for so long, for me it wasn't really an option. I didn't really want to just live a life of just basically scraping to the passing point. I wanted to really try and establish myself, and I wanted to just keep going. But I think I got into a mentality where for a while, for instance, even after I'd quote unquote, I guess, made it and I could like afford to pay rent and I was living in London, I only had to commute like half an hour or 45 minutes compared to like 11 hours like there and back. It was amazing. Like for me personally, like it's a lifestyle, not a career. And so doing this kind of gig economy is really, it's just now just ingrained in me completely. And so I can't think of anything worse than going somewhere where I'm literally just clocking in at 9 and then I forget everything at 5. Even though with film, you can kind of work 11-hour days and then the project's done. It's then all about the next hustle. It's about the trying to find the next job. It's trying to improve your skills. It's trying to do more blog posts. It's trying to find out more about gear, and it's trying to basically offer everything to everyone to try and work on the most interesting stuff around the world.
And when you think about learning the craft, getting to grips with all that gear, is that something you learnt from film school, or is that something you were mainly self-taught, or what was your process for actually learning all of this stuff?
So actually, in terms of, so you can learn quite a lot in film school, and for instance, the setup right now for this podcast it's essentially just a skill in being able to find the right levels, to find a space that is quiet, to find the good mic positioning. And so then it becomes that you save that as kind of a preset for podcast in a room. And now you just need a preset for when you're doing a podcast on a boat, or now you need a preset when you're doing. So the experience comes not just from the fundamental skill. It's like leveling up in a game. And so for me, it was very much like, okay, well, I've done an interview in a, well, I haven't done an interview in a boat, but I've done a film on a boat, or I've done a film on a train, a plane, a bus, and so it's more about just stretching that kind of core knowledge that fundamentally anyone can kind of get if you kind of understand being able to point a microphone at a mouth and then being able to get the right level. Not to diminish the craft. The craft then becomes, well, what do I do on a dinner scene when 6 people are talking and there's 5 cameras? Or what do I do when... So it's then more just
expanding that skill.
Yeah, just growing and building on top of a core principle, just like swimming. So you can swim, you can do doggy paddle. Right, now I'm going to do breaststroke. Now I'm going to do backstroke. Now I'm doing butterfly and dives, and so you can just keep adding to a fundamental skill that you could say is almost natural in terms of what does sound good. Hopefully, because it's not music, it's dialogue. It's quite easy to tell when someone sounds good in a kind of dialogue frame as opposed to say a music frame, which is a bit more kind of art.
So earlier you gave that swimming analogy where you said it's best to just get in the water and have a go if you want to learn to swim. And in terms of your learning style, do you feel that you've just learnt best from hours on set?
Yeah, I'd say that was the biggest thing. And then I think from that you can bounce off whatever kind of theory or kind of the actual physics of sound, for instance. Like, I know people that can make their own cables, like, and do amazing things much more than me. But if you're going in this circle of basically you try something and then you get the feedback from that, then when you go to try again, then you now get into a more useful loop of being able to get the feedback of, well, I put the mic there and it sounded terrible. Let me try and remember that. And maybe if you don't remember that time, you'll remember like 6 times down the row, and you'll just like, you'll get into a pattern of being able to look at a t-shirt or look at a shirt and be able to go, I'd probably mic it there. And then one of the days your go-to solution won't work. And then you'll think of another solution. So then this is where, again, you're building on your craft by just needing to, because sometimes you're not going to get a guy with like a hair. You're going to get a guy with a hairy chest, or you're going to get a guy with a massive beard, or you're going to get a guy that only talks looking at their shoes, or you're going to get a guy like. So, and then it becomes a case of problem solving, and I really like that kind of element of it. So, and that's all from the experience, the feedback, and then having the wider context of maybe like proximity effect to make my voice sound nicer when I'm closer to the microphone, and things like that. So, yeah.
So to sort of segue from that, mentorship. I'm interested to know, have you ever been mentored? And would you say that mentorship is something that's going to be useful again for that sort of up and coming creative?
So I'd say mentorship is very useful, but I think it comes in a lot of different ways now. There's obviously mentors, for instance, if you're doing a course, like your tutor might be like classed as your mentor, right? They've done something related to the kind of field that you're in before, and so they're kind of trying to help you along the way about what they did or what they know other people do. For me, again, it was a case of reverse engineering in terms of doing my own interviews. So I started interviewing. I basically had this idea one day, and then I got an IMDb Pro account for like 30 days, and I emailed 800 people out of like the best films that I could see on IMDb at the time. And these are people like doing Foley and production. And I had to go through, and bearing in mind, that's not like going through and every person has their email address on their like IMDb Pro thing. So I probably went through like at least like 2,000, 3,000 pages of IMDb to like try and find the best people. And then that ended up with like 20 people getting back to me. And then I was like, okay, brilliant. Well, I'll do them all in December. And so then I spent like, yeah. And so now I've ended up with like 40 plus hours of live hangouts.
Yeah. And they're really good, you know. They're great. It's nice to watch.
And that's it. And because I'm in a place where I literally haven't done anything remotely as big in scale or as complex as, for instance, like Mad Max or something like that, it's really good to just kind of not be scared of my inexperience and just kind of use that to my advantage of being like, look, I only know this, that, and the other. So in the context of me doing this, like, how are you doing that on your set? So you can learn a lot definitely from loads of places, from obviously this podcast. This is sort of like some sort of point of reference in you figuring out, okay, well, this person's all the way over here on the spectrum, like getting a bus or whatever, and this person was like living in London, and then they just went to the National Film School and they met a load of really cool people. So I have a couple of options. Like, I probably fit somewhere on the scale in terms of being in the right place at the right time with the right options, to having literally no options but loads of time to kind of work something out. So there's basically a million ways to get to the same place.
So true. And I hope that with this podcast, this can sort of be a platform that can expose people to lots of different opinions and new ideas. Because the creative journey, if you like, from the point of soft skills is so similar. So even though people might be listening to you talk about becoming a sound recordist, the advice as a whole may be able to help them become something totally different. So on the topic of starting a career and your progression, in your experience, what are some of the things that matters and some of the things that don't matter, the red herrings and the things that might lead people astray?
So what matters is your intent and attitude, massively. I think there's, for instance, lots of people that would go in as a sound recordist. And for instance, I get the question a lot, like, what do you do if a director's talking through a take? And
has that happened? That's
yeah, I mean that's happened
awful.
Definitely to a lot of people. And
crikey.
Yeah, and some people, again, it's more on like commercial sets and things like that.
Okay.
So yeah, and on the one hand, obviously as a sound recordist, I'm not getting good work, and so naturally, someone starting out would then think, well, that's the end of my career because I've recorded someone like talking all over the take. But the fact is that it's the director's film, and so you've obviously got to say something. But if they're going to talk over it, or they're happy with it, or they really don't care, then on the other hand, I'm kind of like, okay, well, I've done my bit in terms of my due diligence of like making sure I can get the best sound possible. And if it's impossible, I'm not going to be afraid to kind of be like, well, that's just not going to work with what you have, this, that, and the other.
Sure.
And I would say in terms of getting paid for what you're doing and working on bigger and better stuff, is you need more leverage. So one thing to focus on is anything that can give you more, like, I guess, advantage over anyone else. And that can be from just being a nice person, to being really positive, to like act. For instance, when you're applying on a cover letter, to actually be interested about the project.
Yeah.
And like a lot of people will get to the point, because they're sick of being paid nothing, of they'll now just start to skip and be like, well, how much is it? Because I don't really care what it is. I just want to know that I can get rent. And obviously everyone's situation is different, and it's going to vary massively. But I think that kind of attitude, intent, plays a massive role. I think a thing you don't need to have, it's really hard to think of what you don't need to have.
Are there any sort of myths that you've come across? So one in my experience, and not to want to put words in your mouth, but when I left uni, it was all about gear. It's like, you're not going to get anywhere unless you buy this and this and this. And realistically, I think a lot of people, especially sharing on YouTube and stuff, completely disprove that, because they can make videos that are adored, shared on incredibly budget equipment, just shot in their living room, you know? So yeah, that's just an example, I guess.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. So I've got two then. So definitely that one, and I'll pick up that one in a sec. But I remember there was a talk at the uni, and it was from a researcher, and the researcher had been working for 5 years already in the industry, and they said that they eventually wanted to get on set and eventually become a DOP. And I was just thinking in my head that they're going about it in the wrong way. It's kind of a very, very super traditional way. So I guess the myth is that you need to go in and shadow someone for X amount of years, and then you are good enough to work on your own. The fact is that you'll either be good or you'll not be good. And so, but what that means is that you just have to work on projects where it's not the end of the world if that happens.
Yes.
And so if you're working on something for free, the leverage for you is that if it messes up, or the film never gets finished, or blah, 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 it doesn't really matter.
You're not getting paid.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the trade-off. Like free is a price. And so that means, yeah, so you got to look at it both ways. There's a lot of people that would say don't do anything for free ever. And I think that those people are likely in a very privileged situation. Or, for instance, they already have a background in the industry. They already know people in the industry. They're already working with people in the industry. And so although I would say that definitely don't do commercial projects for free, doing someone's short film that they really want to do and have written the script for, it's up to you to decide, because there's no actual market value for that. The market value is free, because they're going to give it away for free. There is no kind of return. There's no kind of business model. There's no kind of planning. But what you get out of that is a chance to basically exercise your craft, working with people, getting to know the kind of what to do on set, and what's going to happen on set. After a while, I can figure out, like, if they're on the wide shot here, generally they'll go in for the tight, or in the edit, you figure out that they only use the wide shot at the start and the end, so don't fret over the sound in the middle of the wide shot, because then you can just dub over the mid or the close. So you figure out all these things as well, and it makes the job kind of a lot more kind of relaxing. So I would say definitely don't wait to kind of join the kind of traditional pyramid scheme of like following someone until they die and give you all their gear, because gear is like £1 million. It then segues on to, now you can buy lots of gear. It's just making sure you've got the right gear for the job. So it's then having that right balance, because quite a lot of the gear is obviously expensive, but it's also a status symbol, right? So you're either, oh, you've got a MacBook, oh, you must be a creative. Like, oh, you've got Windows, yeah, that must be like, or you've got like an MSN email, like, what are you doing? Like, you don't you have a Gmail, you know what I mean? It's like, it's that kind of thing. So it's like, can you get by with an AOL address? Yes, but it's figuring out for the project if you need to do it. So I'd say, for instance, one of the myths as well is that straight off the bat you have to buy wireless mics. I would say that is the last thing that you buy. You make sure you try and invest heavily in a recorder, in a mixer, or like a combination, obviously, a mixer recorder, and then you buy your shotguns, because they're like your lenses. They're going to last forever.
And what you're hoping to use predominantly all the time, really. If you can not use the lavs, that's a great day, you know?
Yeah, exactly. It makes it easier for everyone, like actors, like basically everyone. The editor, they've only got one choice. I mean, yeah, you need to figure it out. And again, that's another interesting kind of style thing. Like, some people will just lav people all the time, even if they won't use it. But again, that's because they're on feature films. If you're just doing an interview, there's quite a lot of interviews where it's a tight shot and literally literally like it's 1 centimeter above the top of their hairline. And I'm like, it's fine just to boom them. We're in a quiet enough environment and it's going to sound really good. So just trust me on that. It's fine. And then you're not going to see the mic and blah, blah, blah. So I guess, yeah, those are the kind of myths.
So what sort of a role has self-awareness played in your career, would you say?
So self-awareness is definitely something that's ever evolving. And I would say that it kind of just builds into almost identity in a weird way, which is just basically like whatever you've been doing for the longest time is pretty much like who you are. Like if you've been nice to everyone all the time, then that's just who you are and that's just who you're going to be. So conditioning yourself with these kind of habits and ways of going about things until they don't work is I guess part of self-awareness. And just figuring out who you are and what you like me figuring out that I don't want to end up doing massive Hollywood films, because I think that although they can be super fun, I'm sure, and like you're blowing up buildings, or like Transformers are like destroying the city, like that'd be sick to work on. But at the same time, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of kind of, it just doesn't feel quite the same as like people trying to slog it out to try and make this film that's got like an all right script. But you know, if the actors are working and you have a really great team and you're just there for a month, then it can be a really, really kind of fun, scrappy environment. So, but yeah, figuring out yourself, it's a very tough thing to do. But I would say like, what do you value most, and then just try and aim towards that. So what I valued most was just having a career in film, and so I put that over everything else. And then now I'm doing other stuff. Now I'm putting value on everything else, on expanding and exploring other opportunities, like setting up other side businesses and stuff, or like starting a family. And it's like you can only like focus on a certain amount of things. So just focus on what you can kind of control, and that will basically dictate how happy you are, because you'll feel the most in control of your life. And to be self-aware about what you want to focus on and what you actually enjoy is then going to reverse into what you focus on, which will then make you happy, which will then make you really good at what you want to do. And so it'll all kind of cascade, hopefully, if you're consistent, into whatever you want it to be.
And I think consistency is very much the key. I mean, you've definitely proven that. So that's definitely, something good.
Yeah, and I could do so much more. I could be so much more consistent with my videos. I could be so much more consistent with even filming and things like that. I think the problem is you want to find that sweet spot where you're not too comfortable. You want to be in that space where it's kind of pushing you to do a bit more. Yeah. Yeah, because then that means that you're taking in new stuff. And for me personally, it's just like if I get too comfortable, then I just get really... You're
not growing, are you? Yeah. It's about having that growth mentality, keep pushing it. Yeah.
Grow or die kind of thing. It's like, literally, it's like, yeah, so...
Is that your framework then? Is it grow or die, or is it grow and maybe like, I can chill a bit? Or
it's like growing or dying. There's like you're always trading off lots of other things that you could do. I mean,
well, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose it's either grow, you do something, or on the flip side, the other things that you're not doing are dying, really, because you're not giving them the time of day. So
exactly,
interesting.
And so figuring out like early on, for instance, that I only wanted to pursue film allowed me to then narrow down and niche into that area and build a big network in there. If I wanted to be the sound recordist that did everything, it would be a lot harder because my network would be a lot more fragmented. And again, talking about self-awareness, like I'm the type of person that if you give me a new idea and I think it's really good, then I'll just kind of go with it until I literally am exhausted, and then there'll kind of be a new thing. So I go through waves of like making videos, or like doing websites, or like setting up businesses on the side, or like doing like all sorts of things, and then I'll just go at it with like 100%, and then I just try and get myself into a framework of getting back there, because then that's where the consistency comes from, and you end up with like 700 videos on YouTube. So
awesome. That is so cool.
It's tricky though.
So one of the things, again, one of the themes that I want to sort of explore with this podcast is failure. And it sounds really extreme. And I think when you're starting out, it's one of those things that you always want to avoid. You're like, no, I'm going to do this. It's going to be perfect. There's going to be nothing that goes wrong. But in my experience, I've started to learn that you actually have to embrace failure, and you have to realize that some things are just going to go wrong. And that's part of a learning experience. But I'm just interested to know if you can think of any scenarios where things haven't gone right, but they've actually been a really valuable learning experience in hindsight.
Yeah, so I think probably the best one is, again, that feature film that I got at the very start from Mandy.com. So it's like there was a lot of positive things that spun off from that. But
it's incredible as your first job as well. Like,
yeah, first job out, but it's, I mean, to try and to have never really done a feature film like all the way in kind of school. They like brought us in to like assist on a feature film for a while, or someone was gonna make a feature film, and you were on a couple of days, and then everyone was trading places because obviously you can't work on it the whole time. So this was my first one. It was all on me. There was no boom operator or anything, so it was just me. I obviously had to buy all the gear that I thought would be good for it, so I ended up having it was an Edirol R44.
Yeah.
So there was no kind of mix track. There's just kind of 4 separate tracks that became a mix because you were listening to them all at the same time.
Right.
So there was no like ISOs. There was no
dear. Okay.
Yeah. So there was no real like picking and choosing of what you actually want to hear.
Yeah.
And then, but this is from a road movie, so it's going from London to Turkey, driving over 6 weeks, and there's 4 main characters in this car, and I basically have a boom, an NTG2, and 2 G3s.
Right.
to be able to do all of that.
Crikey.
So, and then there was lots of logistical things, like we had to be at certain places at certain times to get boats, to get trains, to get whatever, to get across all these countries.
And just also to put this into perspective for people that are listening, you know, that are sort of in that framework of starting out, I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but you had to get the money for the job paid up front in order to buy the gear before you left.
So I only had the Edirol R44. I had no microphones, I had no boom pole, I had no XLR cables, I had nothing. And I'd come back from Canada after basically just being on my own, just wandering around thinking, fuck, I'm just wasting like loads of time. It's ridiculous. I'm sure everyone's already like winning BAFTAs and all this kind of stuff. So then it comes to the point that I'm on every single day on Mandy, 2 weeks with like nothing going on. And I'm just sitting there pressing refresh and applying for every single job that comes up, whether it's good, bad, or in between.
Wow.
And again, Mandy, like with all these free job sites, it's all about being one of the first people, because who's going to read like 300 emails and make a calculated real judgment? Even if the Oscar winner is like number 400, by the time you get there, it doesn't matter. You've already chosen, or the film's already over. But the reason I got the job is I was only interviewed basically on my personality and how I would have done stuff without gear that I didn't have. So then it came to it, and I was like, okay, great, I've got the job. So I just need my fee up front because I need to buy some gear. And it literally came on the Monday, and we only had 3 days in London, and then we were in Calais. So we were in France. And then we worked our way through France, and then we went to Switzerland for a bit, and then we were in Italy for a bit, like driving all the way through, and then we got a boat across to Greece, and then we spent the last 2 weeks in Turkey. And the film never actually got finished because in the editor and the director died. So so I've never seen the finished film, but I can only imagine that they probably had to do quite a lot of ADR. Just because of some of the scenarios and some of the shots, and if 4 people are talking at the same time in a wide shot, I definitely only have 2 of them mic'd. So that in terms of like a failure, but giving me just a hell of a lot of like immersive therapy of like how to record sound is like 6 weeks with every day doing 12-hour days in a different country every time, going into a different hotel, recording in boats and on trains and on buses and on cars and on the beach and in the sea and like all sorts of mad stuff.
But when you put yourself back in that sort of scenario, that you don't have the confidence where, you know, now you've got 500 plus projects. If you had that similar job, you'd know what gear you need and you'd feel fairly confident, I would assume. But where do you sort of get that confidence or that courage to go into that situation to do that for the first time? Because I think there's a lot of people that will be looking on Mandy or on diary services, they'll be applying for these jobs, and they will literally have that horrible fear within them, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. Yet you were willing to take as one of your earliest jobs a film going across multiple countries, you know, with people that you'd never met before, with gear that you hadn't worked with. If you put yourself in that situation, where did that confidence come from?
So I think if that opportunity had arose and that had been like film school, in terms of if in 3 years I had only done one project, I think I would have been woefully even more underprepared, not just technically with the gear, but how I was going to get around stuff.
Sure.
So the fact that I had already practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced in terms of the previous films, you got to think really already at this point, even though it's my first film outside of uni, it's probably like my 30th film in terms of a short film. And I was also doing most of the sound design on these films as well. So I already then had the knowledge of both, well, little knowledge, but, you know, some knowledge about sound design in terms of editing and kind of putting it all together. And I was already in a place where you kind of hit rock bottom. I mean, the failure before that was like just wasting a year and then going to Canada and then basically spending a month in a country where I couldn't really do anything, just thinking about what I should be doing. So having a lot of time to think about what you really, really want to do when you're the other side of the world really gives you a nice kind of rounded context as to, not trying to waste any more time. But then to come back and spend 2 weeks every day, the equivalent of what everyone probably does on Facebook or Instagram these days, just clicking refresh and just seeing what's new and just trying and tweaking the website and doing this, that, and the other. It just came to a point of almost desperation that this came in. And so this was basically the chance. And so there wasn't really this kind of like questioning myself, because at this point I'd already spent basically 12 months like psyching myself up to get to this point. So there wasn't really an option. If there was an option of me like thinking that I couldn't do it, I couldn't really say no in France. It's very different like if you just live down the road to just like bail on a project. But if I'm like halfway through and I'm in Italy, I'm like, well, I can't really afford a plane ticket home, so I guess I'm staying. Like,
absolutely. Have you ever experienced that sort of feeling of self-doubt though? I mean, if you think back maybe in some of your earlier days, because I think it's great that, you know, you've really sort of taken advantage of the educational experience that, you know, now is a time to fail. If I'm going to make mistakes, I'll make mistakes here on all of these films that are, you know, lower budget or smaller or student, whatever. But just thinking about self-doubt, have you ever experienced that now? For example, you go onto a job, you think, you know, this is a situation I feel uncomfortable, and then maybe you come back to the craft. I'm just interested to know what your sort of strategy is for dealing with that, and have you experienced that?
Yeah, so definitely more so earlier on. There's things like when microphones die in like the middle of a take. There's things where even like my recorder, like it's like malfunctioning, and I have to like ring up like tech support and figure out like how to make it work, and like everyone's waiting on me. So those are definitely like big points of just self-doubt in terms of like, oh shit, like everything's just like gone wrong. Great, so it's all out of my control. So but how I bring it back is it's always just with focusing or trying to focus on the things that are in my control and having a plan of what next. So one of the best things you can do in terms of when there's a sound issue is not just flag the problem, but suggest a solution straight off the bat.
Yeah, love it.
And with that, hopefully you have a few different solutions. And so always, generally when people are interacting with the sound department, it's because there's probably going to be a problem. Generally, because no one really even asks if sound was
happy
good.
with that.
I've had directors listening with the cans on, and a plane's gone straight over, but they've been so engrossed, like mouthing all of the beautiful dialogue that they've written, that they've not noticed the plane. So it can get to that point as well. But yeah, so the self-doubt only comes in when things go wrong that cost you a take or cost you a performance, because then it's not just about you anymore. It's about, like, if it just happened in isolation from me, then it's something I can kind of deal with because there's no kind of consequences with anyone else.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so you're in this weird duality of basically focusing on everything you have to do, but then how that fits in with what everyone else is doing. And so there's been points where for instance, you can use like the wrong type of tape that like slightly damages a shirt, for instance.
Oh, right.
Things
Wow.
like that.
Okay.
If things are too sticky and this is like
course.
a felt shirt or whatever. So there's been times, for instance, where you use the wrong type of tape on like a delicate fabric, like a felt shirt, and then even those like Rycott stickies, you're peeling them back, and then all the adhesives getting stuck to the shirt, and the person's freaking out. Or Yeah, that's it's just kind of little things like that, really, that then can bring in the self-doubt about like how you are coming across. You're allowed to build up your reputation before you get onto the job, but then it's all about what you actually do on the day. It's like, okay, brilliant, I'm a footballer, but then I go out onto Wembley Stadium and I just like completely flop. It doesn't matter if I have like 7 million followers on Instagram. If I really can't play football, well, that's kind of what they like paid me to do. So it's just making sure that you're covering your basics, because again, just like going back to the gaming analogy, as long as you've passed level 1, then you're pretty much there. Then everything else is up for discussion about, like, for instance, if a shot really isn't working for you booming, ask the director, like, is there another way we can do this? If you're with a really good team, or if you have the self-confidence yourself to ask another member of the team, the DOP, and hopefully you have a supportive one, because they are the best, then they can help you too, and they can be like, okay, well, I can shoot it from this way, or why we won't do 2 cameras on this, we'll just do 1 camera, because I know that you're basically shafted on one of the angles if I use both cameras because of the shadows. So let's just do this one, and then we can all do our kind of best work. So it's finding that fine line between like basically always asking every single department to make your life easier, as it might come across, and basically having the onus, the kind of self-responsibility, I guess, to do whatever you can and then realize where your limits are. But the plans will always change, the dialogue will usually always change, and so will your approach. And so experience will then dictate what you've done in the past, and so then you can come up with a load of solutions that will hopefully work with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So consistency, I think, is definitely one of the things that been a huge contributor to your success. But if you had to put a pin in a couple of other things, just fairly quickly, what would you say are some of the key points that have led to your success?
So I would still go back to intent. I really wanted to be making a living. I wouldn't even say successful necessarily, but success for me was tied up with basically making a living doing sound and doing kind of cool projects. I would say attitude, especially on set. I think if you are a happy sound person, it's a bit of a unicorn from the like tradition of like the miserable mixer just waiting for the plane to go over. Definitely having like a lot of banter with people and just kind of like keeping morale up sometimes, because a lot of other departments, especially on lower budget films, have way more stress than you just coming in like 3 seconds before they say roll sound and a plane goes over. Everyone else is worrying about a million different things. So that, and apart from like consistency, it's like when you match it with attitude and intent, just means that you consistently come across as like a person who is very professional, who knows what they're doing, but is also a lot of fun and can get on with. And at the end of the day, when you're spending like 12, sometimes 14, sometimes much more illegal hours with a group of people you don't know for maybe a short period of time, you want to try and make a good impression, because again, word gets around, and I know plenty of people that, again, they have all the kind of credits, but what people say about them behind their back, right. It just makes, as soon as anyone's kind of gossiping about anyone else, I'm just thinking like, oh my god, like what do people say about me? Do people think like I'm full of it just because I have a load of YouTube videos, that kind of thing? So it doesn't. You will get on for your credits and things like that, but it's whether you'll get hired again.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned before that you obsess over the new thing. It's like, right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on it. I'm going to do loads of work, produce loads of content. I'm also interested to know, though, one, where do you get your energy from? And secondly, how do you recharge? Do you actually like switch off, or is it a constant, it's just a forever game?
So I am very good at sleeping. Nice. Usually at very inappropriate times, like just napping generally, but also the freelance lifestyle, fortunately, it gives me lots of time, and it does give me a lot of time off. And to be honest, they basically correlate with each other. That if I didn't have all this energy, the problem is, and it's happened to me before, I definitely go through just lulls of not doing more than I should. And I then just get into this pattern of just like existing almost, which is kind of a fancy word of basically saying doing absolutely nothing and just falling asleep or watching Netflix, and just, it's good to have those days now and again, like after you've done a massive film. But the problem for me more and more is keeping that level of energy up when you don't have to. Before, and for a long time, for like a couple of years, it builds in a good habit of you having to do stuff, because I literally had to do stuff. I think my first year I made like £5,000, and that's not like deducting bus travel. So
Okay, yes.
yeah, and the bus is like £30, but it's still like it's a sizable portion of
Oh yeah,
like
you're 5K, yeah.
what I made. Yeah. So yeah. So, but now when you're earning kind of more and more, especially when you get up to the realms of like 50, 60,000, which is for me starting out, you don't really think about it before. You're like, well, obviously I have to go on like Mad Max to make like 60 grand. It's like, no, you don't. You just have to work on a lot of different stuff and a lot of commercial projects, and yeah, just be able to serve as many people as possible. And actually, because of that focus, for instance, my first year was 5,000, my next year was 15, and my third year was 30. And that's mainly just because I'd actually physically moved to London. And it's just kind of been rising ever since, based on, again, just demands of whatever I was aiming for next. So for me, the time to recharge is kind of any time, because any time that I don't have anything that I'm trying to work on, I basically don't focus on anything, and so I then just take a step back.
So you really do strike me as a really positive person from our conversations, and I'm interested to know, how do you always stay so positive? Because I'm sure there's going to be people that are listening to this that maybe things haven't gone as well, and they find themselves in a situation where they're not feeling so great, or maybe 3, 4, 5 jobs haven't gone so well, and they're starting to feel a little bit defeated. So how do you sort of stay motivated, and how do you always sort of bounce back?
I love the Alan Partridge reference, and I would say that people got to realize that they're not alone. I would say that I come across as a positive person because generally, I think only a few times I've shared when it's kind of really going bad for me, or I'm really frustrated with something. But that's just because once you've kind of documented so much, you kind of figure people know roughly what you're about. Otherwise, basically think you're full of it if everything is always perfect. It kind of goes hand in hand with like what you see on social media, and you're only seeing like the bipolar things of like someone's really happy one day and they're looking at a rainbow, and then the next time like someone knocks over their latte and like the whole world's over. So again, there's obviously a lot more serious scenarios than that, but yeah, I think gratitude is almost like a really important part of it, because obviously I've like now made it, and that doesn't actually mean like retirement and death, making it from like the traditional, like I've got a job for life now, great, so I'll just wait for the gold watch, and yeah, that's me now. So it probably comes back to being more in control. So whatever your struggle is, it's either that you try and somehow take responsibility for it, because then you're more in control of it. Whether that's feasible or correct, I don't know. I kind of find myself more and more these days just taking responsibility for a lot of things that I probably shouldn't take responsibility for. Okay. Just purely for the fact that then I can deal with it if I feel like it's my own making, because then I can kind of change it. Okay. It's probably not, maybe it's a healthy thing or not a healthy thing, I don't know, but it's really interesting the more and more that kind of mental awareness comes out and things like that, like how people are coping and dealing with stuff. And so it's tempting to say that you should go talk to someone, but me personally, I just tend to get really, really quiet, and again, just figuring it out myself. And then I'm very happy to be like super vocal. Whereas I know loads of other people that are super vocal about their problems, and then maybe that exacerbates it or something. Just me looking from the other side. So it comes back to self-awareness. And so for me, I just get really quiet, and then I just figure out the next thing. If it doesn't work, or if I don't want to do the app anymore, or if I feel like I'm not motivated to do videos, I just kind of I go, okay, well, I'll stop doing it, and then hopefully I'll come back to it again. And I've still got time. I've still got time as well. So if you've got time and options, then this is the thing where any struggle then becomes a choice. Because if you're just stuck in that kind of mindset of struggle, it's very hard to get out if you don't feel you have any options. Unfortunately, like in life, there's definitely like I feel super like privileged and grateful that I even had options to go to university, for instance, or had options to live in the UK, or had options where London is probably like the biggest, maybe still, I don't know, but one of the biggest filming location or hubs in the whole of Europe, let alone probably the rest of the world, potentially.
Yeah.
And so, although I'm going 500 miles, there's someone that could be going like 10,000 miles to go to the next thing, or like, you can scale it back. And so always your struggle in the context of the rest of the world can make your struggle look like more insignificant. Not that it necessarily should. You should obviously we're all trying to deal with our own kind of emotional baggage at the same time. But when you try and put it in comparison to just being alive, or like just living and just doing, like recording sound, it sounds a bit like a joke when it's like it's almost like saying I'm struggling to like win a Nobel Prize. You're kind of like, you're struggling for like that level of success. There's like so many people that are like struggling to pay rent, not just like struggling to like change the world. So there's different things, and we kind of take on our own. I personally feel like why I'm always keeping going is because I like the struggle almost, especially when it's kind of self-imposed, because then if I'm kind of giving up or whatever, then it's kind of okay, because I knew that was my choice as well. It was kind of my choice to get into this kind of thing of like these side businesses that I'm doing now, or like trying to generate more content again on like all these different platforms or whatever. It's self-inflicted, so I can't really complain that much. And then if I do, it's fine, because then it's just me getting it all out. So hopefully that roughly answers your question. But basically, if anyone's listening out there who's basically just in a bit of a rut with the films that they're working on, or they're not working with the people that they like, I would say just basically speed up that failure rate, and you will basically end up weeding out all the people that you won't have to rely on to work with again. And then you can basically just say, no, you don't want to work with them because you've got money coming from elsewhere. Or it can be as simple as that, really. Because, again, coming back to your 5 people kind of thing, it's the same with work. If you're working with a load of people that are always miserable, or always think like the industry's going to end, or it was never the same, or blah, 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 then you're going to quickly get very kind of disenthused with kind of the whole operation and why you got into starting this in the first place.
Absolutely. Matt Price, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you, audience.
Hey there, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. And if you want to follow Matt, he can be found at Sound Rolling on Instagram and YouTube. And to keep up to date with the podcast, we're at The Creative Venture. And do let us know what you think of the show. Feedback of all kinds is super helpful. You can drop us a review and a rating, especially on Apple Podcasts. Anyway, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again on the next Creative Venture podcast.